This is the fun one for me, sort of, kind of. I started with VMS in 1979. Um, I was in college at the time, and the college acquired an 11780. It was not a prototype, but it was a low numbered one. I don't remember anymore what the number was, but it was relatively low. Uh, the VMS version, again, I don't recall exactly. I know it preceded 1.5, which was, I think, the most popular or one of the original consumer released versions was 1.5. 1.25 megabytes of main memory, which on a 780 is 5 memory boards. They were hex height boards, about yay high. I didn't have one, or I would have brought one in with me. Supported 48 terminals with this thing. The console was an LA120, which was an upgrade from others that their system was an LA30, 36, I think, which is a paper-based terminal. A TE16 tape drive with 800 or 1600 BPI, which for a 200 megabyte disk was somewhere between 17 and 19 tapes to do a backup. An RPO6, which was a mass bus device, 200 megabytes in size. And RMO5 was added after about 6 months to give us more disk space, which was 256 megabytes of memory. And this is the drive. This is 256 megabytes of memory, not gigabytes, megabytes. This is the drive. Okay. RPO6 was the same size. You had to take the bottom off, screw it into the drive, and then take the cover off. And this is actually one of the drives from that 780, by the way.
It was like a washing machine when it was
Yes.
upright shape.
And it dawned on me today that particular drive was acquired in, I believe it was the early 1980, which means that physical device right there is probably older than some of you guys that are in the room right now. The line printer was a 300 line per minute line printer, which would take half forever to print a box of paper. And I don't recall the number of the card reader. If it was a CR04 or a CR01. I honestly don't remember. It was too long ago. But it had a card reader on it because we started stuff with cards.
Could I just hold this up so you guys can take a photo of it?
Sure.
All right. Yeah.
Oh, you want to take a picture of it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's his story.
Seeing your arm workout now too.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No problem.
Right?
Yeah.
The original system was primarily Fortran, and I believe that Fortran at that time was the RSX version, and it was running in compatibility mode. Myself and 5 other colleagues at the university had exclusive access to this thing for a semester or two, and our job was to get it ready for the general student population, which we sort of did. Took a few more semesters to get it down pat, but we got there. Version 2, I believe, is when backup came into existence. Again, this is a little bit fuzzy because this goes back a few years, but prior to that, there was a product or a process called DSC, or Disk Save and Compress, which was not the best product around, but it was all we had.
Yeah, this is scrambling for us.
What? That was the other name for it. Yes. Version 2 is about the time frame that the 11750 came about, which was about 80% of the capacity of the 780, but significantly smaller physically. And I think the 750 was one of the most popular models ever because of its size and its price. But version 3 came out and it had the 11725, which was even smaller. I want to say it's probably about the size of a little bit smaller than the size of this podium here, but it was a much slower based box. And Unibus discs came out in version 3, and there's the RA series. And I don't honestly recall the size of them, but the RA60 was removable, smaller than this. The RA80 and the RA81 were sealed devices. The interesting part about that was the mass bus, which this drive was on, what they call the mass bus, was 2.2 megabytes per second transfer rate, and the Unibus was 1.1 megabytes transfer rate. But with the advent of the RA style drives, because of out of order IOs that were handled by the controller, there were many, many times where the Unibus would outperform MassBus in IO, particularly for users because their IOs were typically very, very small. So that was always fun. 11782 came out, which is a 2 CPU 780, basically. But the second one was just for computes. It was just basically a number crunching engine. It was asymmetric multiprocessing as opposed to symmetric multiprocessing, which is what we use today. There were tools that were used that I used on many sites to see whether a 782 would benefit people or not. And there were a couple of times when it said, yeah, it would help, but it didn't really.
You could get a floating point accelerator for a 750. I don't know what version that came in.
Yeah, I don't remember that one either,
Yeah.
but I know that there were floating point systems was one that I recall, but there were a couple of vendors that had vector processors that could attach to the Unibus and do effectively the same thing, and they were just floating point number crunchers. That's all they were. HSC 50 controller came out there, and I don't believe that its initial release had shadowing just yet. It was just a controller that allowed you to get more drives and better performance overall. VMS version 4 micro VMS came into existence, which nobody probably remembers much, but that was for the Microvax boxes, which were had some of the actual instructions weren't in hardware, but were in microcode. So it wasn't quite as fast as the full-blown box, but it was significantly smaller, probably about the size of a small heater or a radiator or something.
Yeah, so you had a Microvax 1 and then a
Microvax
Microvax 2.
Yep.
Yeah.
Clusters came into being. TPU came into existence then. The VAX 8600, which was a bigger box, came into existence then, and shadowing appeared. The 8000 class machines here, the VAX 8800 was the first machine that could contain 512 megabytes of main memory, which was at the time the architectural maximum for VAX VMS. And that was the first box that could have that much. And I recall that a lot of complaints came in because it took a long time to boot. And at the time, the default was to check memory during the boot process. And if you're checking memory 1 byte or one long word at a time, and there's 512 megabytes, it takes a little while. So the quote fix was to turn off memory check on the boot, and lo and behold, it actually booted quickly. Minor nit. Microvax 2000 came out about that time, and I want to say that was roughly the size of this box.
Yeah.
And
It had a handle.
it had a handle on it. Yeah.
I used to handle. That was supposed to be a tail.
Oh, yeah.
Cable. It really wasn't.
Yeah, well, we all used it as a handle anyway. But when that came out, I was working in Nashua at the time, living in New Boston, New Hampshire. And for whatever reason, I think the facility is going to be shut down for a few days or something. And I had work to do. So I'm walking out the parking lot with a Microvax 2000 in my hand and suddenly realized that the 780 that I had that fell through the false floor that we had at the university once, I was holding in my hand. So instead of 3 refrigerators worth of machine, I had it in my hand. That was kind of when it said, oh, things have progressed a bit.
It's Moore's law, right?
Yeah. Little did I know that things were going to continue along that line, but
I actually got Microvax 2000 and I upgraded it from the 4-plane graphic to 8-plane. So I had 256 colours from 16. So
there you go.
that was quite a step up.
Yeah,
What was
exactly.
it before deck windows? Was that GKS?
That was one. Yep.
Yeah.
And yeah. Yep.
Deck windows came in 5.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there was another Windows.
It was VWS.
Yeah.
VWS.
Yes.
Yeah.
What was GKS? Graphic.
Graphics. That's a graphic kernel.
Kernel software, yeah.
What years are?
Honestly,
80s-ish.
this is the 80s. Yeah, I don't have all the years down
Finals came out in '88.
because it's kind of a blur. When you get to be my age,
Yeah, because
You
it
just-
might come out one year, but you're.
Yeah, I was doing support at this point, so I was covering all kinds of different versions. So it's a little bit of a blur as to which year, what came out which year. I tried to get some of the important things out here. Um, by the time 5X came out, I was in Nashville doing pre-release testing. So I got to play with a lot of stuff, and it's a blur as to when it was available to me versus when it was available to the public. And I honestly never tracked it that closely. Uh, that was a fun job. Um, VAX 6000 classes came introduced, and the VAX 4000, which was a small desktop. Well, not all desktops, but a lot of the desktops were 4000 class boxes. Um, and then Alpha came along. That was the late 90s, mid to late 90s.
Early.
92,
92. That's right.
92, yeah.
Again, it's a bit of a blur, but that was the VAX version 6 code base is where that came into play. And that's when my focus moved away from VAX and more onto Alpha, because the group I was in did all the VAX to Alpha porting for the external customers. And again, I brought some. We'll go through the other stuff later. One of the things I did was I was in the porting and performance group, and we dealt with customer base to move their products from VAX to Alpha. And initially, I tried to teach macro to the other members of my group, and that the class went well, but nobody was interested. So I ended up spending all my time doing all the macro porting from VAX to Alpha, which was fun. And that's where the CLI came into being, because I was the only poor bum that knew that stuff. So that was fun. Around that same time, the DEC 3000 class box came about, and I actually still have one of those, and I booted it up about a year and a half ago, and it still boots up just fine. And I recall when I got that machine how blazingly fast it was. I think it's just as fast now as it was then, but it's not fast.
Did that run Ultrix too?
The fuel
Yes.
accelerated.
Could run
Yeah.
Ultrix or VMS?
I got the second one, but it's still not fast. It's just kind of amazing how your perspective changes over the years. You guys probably had some of those 3000s back then too, didn't you? And did you think they were fast at the time?
Yeah, relative to a VAX.
Yeah, and they're pitifully slow now, but
We didn't know any better though, right? We haven't
Right.
seen any.
yeah, exactly. 6.1 was the first common release for both, and that was, I think, the first widespread release outside of the company.
95-ish.
Command recall was relatively new back then, and I cannot imagine now not having that.
You mean recall, not variable, no. Recall.
Yes, yes.
Oh.
And again, a bunch of hardware releases. I didn't want to list them here, but then version 7 came out, and 64-bit addressing started getting into play, and that created a whole bunch of different issues with some software and stuff. A bunch of more alpha models came out. Galaxy was introduced at that time for some of the GS models. I don't know how widespread that was actually used, but I only got onto one machine that was using Galaxy. I never got onto much more than that. I think it was great in concept, but I don't think a lot of people ended up using it.
It was ahead of its time. Like CPU migration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
7.3 was released. That's the final release for VAX systems. 7.3-2 is the final 7X release for alphas. And at that time, it was released. The 1280 came out, and the DS15. I'm still using a DS15 today. It works pretty well.
7.2 is where where you got ODS 5 that came out.
Yes.
Yeah.
We still have some customers who recently who ran 7.3.
Oh, I have a lot of them that are running 7.3. I got this was kind of amusing. I got a call from a client who wanted to, was thinking about upgrading to version 8 and potentially version 9. And we were talking about all kinds of various things. He was on 7.3. And I said, yeah, it can be done. It's not a big deal. Should be fairly straightforward, blah, 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 blah. come to find out he's got a vax. I said, yeah, no, that ain't, that's not gonna happen. So he was just thinking about a recompile and going. I said, no, it's gonna be probably a little more than that. Then, 8.4-2 was the final release by HPE. And then, of course,
8.4.
Yeah, we
Or
released
8.4 was the final HP release.
I thought they had a -1 and -2.
No.
That was you?
Our first release was 84-1 H1.
Yeah.
And that
Oh,
was
okay.
followed by 84-2. But HP was last release for.
Okay, that's my error. Okay, I had that wrong. Okay.
And they did like 1 billion updates.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think it was quite 1 million. Maybe,
Yeah.
maybe 900,000.
I think they did 13.
Yeah, at least 16.
16.
Yeah. Okay. So the interesting part to me is that with the x86 release, that's the 4th hardware platform for VMS, which I don't know of any other operating system that comes even close. I think IBM, one of their OSs went on at least 2, but I
Well,
don't.
MBS, now runs on on x86.
Does it run directly or is it only emulated?
COS,
Yeah.
Linux.
COS does run.
Yeah. Okay.
I recently
So-
worked for a for a customer that was running 5.5.2 on Backstage.
Yeah.
4,000.
So-
That's a customer.
Here's a few of the things that are interesting to me. So this is the source listing for VMS version 1 on Fiche. Okay. The last release that I'm aware of that came out on Fiche was VMS 5.5. That's VMS 5.5. So
Yeah.
that's how much it's grown. Now it's 5.5, which was what, 80?
5.5 came out in 90.
Uh,
90.
was it 90 or 89? 90?
Yeah, no, because 5.0 came out in 88.
Okay.
5.5.2 came out in early 90s. So
Was it 90? Okay, it was 90.
Yeah.
Came out in 92.
Yeah, that's 2.
Okay. So this is 5.5. And that was the last one that was released on Fiche. My wife doesn't appreciate the fact that I still have this stuff, but this to give you an idea, this is what's called the VAX software source book, and this lists the applications that were available for VAX VMS at the time. This particular one was the first one. This was in 1984, and this is when that was listed. Hardware handbook from 82, 83, and you can get an idea of it had the VAX specific architecture information in here. And this one here is from 88, which has some of the machines available, which are the 11,725, 730, 750, 780, 785, 782, 8600, and 8650. And it shows you some of the devices and stuff that we feel free to look at these too. Of interest, again, going back a few years, VMS internals, I think the first classes were for version 2 is when they had it. And this is the internals book from version 2.2. This book was kept under lock and key at the training center because this book alone, if you wanted to buy it, was $300 back in 82. It was not cheap and they didn't want them swiped. If you took the class, you actually got one of these. That was like, woohoo. But this is always interesting to take a look at. And you'll see the stuff that is the same today as it existed way back then, because in some respects, very little has changed. But you'll be free to take a look at that too. That was always interesting. And these are the accompanying books that went with it. I brought along a copy of the class that I taught for VAX to Alpha to try to describe to the customer base about the Alpha system itself, which is some of the instruction set, how the call procedures, and all that kind of wondrous stuff. If you want to take a look at that, this is all macro, by the way.
Were you an instructor at Bedford? Or?
No, I was actually did the class for the customers that came into the porting and performance group. So, I mean, I've been teaching classes. I taught at the university for a while too, Fortran and macro, and that was always fun too. And what I found interesting, this is a VAX 11 guide to tuning that was written in 1979. And interestingly enough, some of the concepts from back then are still valid today, although at slightly different magnitudes because things are further along today than they were back in
Shadowing.
79. No, not in 79, no. Hardware shadowing came first, and that was with the HSCs, I believe. Software shadowing kind of did two hops. It originated, my understanding is it originated as a software services project for a particular customer out of the Maryland office in the US, and that it eventually ended up in VMS engineering and it was updated and fixed and whatever since then. I believe that was the original source to the current version of the host based stuff today. But that was that had to have been in the year, probably mid 80s, I think, somewhere around there. That's got a pretty interesting history in and of itself. But no, I know of customers that have been on VMS since the early 80s and are still on VMS today, have gone through 3 architectures, trying to get them to the 4th. Not sure they're kind of stuck because the RDB's not out yet, but hopefully we'll get them to the 4th one. But started as a field test for they had version 3, field tested version 4 using ACMS, and they're on. I honestly don't know if I think they're on the BSI version of VMS right now on Itanium, still running ACMS, transaction processing system, and are still moving forward today. But it's been an interesting ride. The only other thing I want to bring up is because I got people arguing with me about this once. Back when I was in the field back in the early 80s, I did not want to cart around 3 bookcases worth of documentation when I was doing consulting work. So Digital came out with a fiche version of the documentation set. And I remember going to a boot camp back in 2017 and somebody arguing with me and said, there is no such thing. Well, I was one of the 5 people that actually paid for this stupid thing, so maybe that's probably why. But this is the VMS documentation from here to here that existed back in that day, which was not only VMS, but also all of their products that were out there at the time, or at least the ones they put on fiche. So if somebody wants to take a look at that, you won't be able to read much of this fiche, but at least it's here. So that's still exists.
Have a fiche reader?
I do, yeah. But
It's nice and index as well.
but I also have service manuals that are on fiche, so that's I do electronic service, so I still have those on fiche. But yeah, it's been an interesting ride for me. I've never done development. I do not have a development bone in my body. I never will. But I've always been a maintainer, even when being a maintainer was a bad thing back in the early 80s, because you were considered second-class citizen if you were a maintainer. If you weren't a developer, you were nothing. But it's been fun, and I'm probably one of the few people who can say I've had VMS as my career from day one to today. Technically, I should be retired. I'm 67, but I'm having way too much fun. I'll be going for a while yet. But it's been an interesting ride over the years. And hopefully some of you young guys will have as much fun as I did. Questions, comments, money? But it's been fun.
What was RDB and ACMS called? They had a name for that whole family of products.
Interesting you bring that up. The site that I resided in, the state of Connecticut, that had the field test for version 4 was field test for ACMS as well. They had a PDP-11, and the system that was running on that was called Trax. Trax did not have a very good reputation. I think they were one of 2 or 3 sites in the world that actually ran that thing. And when ACMS first came out, because it was transaction processing, it was originally called Trax 32. But they changed the name because Trax had such a bad reputation. They figured if they called it Trax 32, it would never take off. And it got renamed to ACMS. But it's been around since version 4.0 or 4.1, one of the 2. 4.0, I think. They did classify ACMS, RDB, and CDD together. I forget what they call it.
Well, there's the,
Yeah.
the VAX information architecture.
That's what it was.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
VIA. Thank you. I knew it was something. I couldn't remember what. But yeah, that had
That's
everything.
what I was looking for.
And I actually tried to quit digital once, right after a meeting with a customer. The CDD had just come out, and I'll name the company. It doesn't really matter at this point. It was called Hamilton Standard. It was Connecticut, and they wanted to put into a database all of their existing blueprints that they had, and it was massive, massive. And we had a meeting, and they were talking about how many of these documents they wanted to archive and put into a database to be able to find and everything else. And I called out my boss and I asked him if he answered the phone. I asked him, I said, "Am I fired yet?" And the system manager at the time at Hamilton was with me. And he looks at me and he starts laughing. And my boss said, "No, damn it." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I don't want to do this work." And the system manager looked at me and he said, "You know what? I don't either." They ended up not doing it for a while because it turns out they weren't really ready to make it all happen. They wanted to store it effectively as what would be today called PDFs, but the process wasn't ready to handle that size. It was all D-size paper too. It's the big stuff. They just didn't have the mechanism to do it, to have it that it would be usable for lookups and stuff. But yeah, it was fun.
I guess that's somewhere in the cloud now.
It could be. And the thing that's interesting too is the problems everybody encounters today are completely different from the problems we encountered years ago. And some of that, I think it was a lot of fun back then in some cases too. But I went to a site that was having a problem because they couldn't back up a disk. It would get to a certain point and just fail. And I go down there and I'm supposed to try to fix this. And I asked them, "Well, it got to a certain file and then stopped. It just wouldn't work." I said, "Well, what's in that file?" He says, "Well, nothing important." I said, "Well, do you need it?" "No."
No.
"Well, delete it." Seemed reasonable, right? So they deleted the file and never had a problem after that. And I said, "Okay, next." I mean, they were looking for this complex thing. How are we going to fix this to get this back up? "Do you need it?" "No." "Get rid of it." It seemed like a simple solution to me, but
It was backed up somewhere if they had to get it back, right?
it was an audio file. It was a company that well, it was can't think of the name of the company now, but they did toys. And it was basically it was an audio file that they used to shrink down using compression techniques, so it would respond to. It was like toys that would have voices. Milton Bradley it was actually. But the kinds of problems you run into today are different from back then. Naval Underwater Systems Division down in New London, Connecticut, had a training facility with a turret that came out of the floor, which was basically to pilot a submarine. And they had screens all the way around. They were using VAXs with Ramtech drivers that would put video up on, and you basically try to pilot the sub through, what's an old world video game.
Like a simulator? Or
Yeah, to train pilots. And every once in a while, the machine would crash. And I got involved because I was trying to do the crash stuff and try to figure out what was going on, look at the drivers, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, it comes down to the fact that the Ramtech interface card was faulty. The microcode was bad. So back in those days, it sat on the Unibus, and you would put a grant request, and you'd be given the bus. You do what you got to do, and you give it back. This particular thing, when it got the permission to use it, it would pass the grant along. So if somebody else down the line had also put a request, you'd effectively have two interface cards that were trying to use the bus at the same time, and bad things happen. So of course, what's the solution? Got to fix the microcode. Well, that was going to take a long time. So they couldn't afford to wait that long. So the fix was to take the Ramtech driver from here, put it over here. So that the only thing further down the bus than the Ramtech driver was the terminator. That was the fix. Now, can you do that with stuff today and just move things around and all of a sudden stuff works? I doubt it, because things don't work that way anymore. But these are the kind of problems that we faced back in the day that were kind of amusing.
Certainly when you were configuring 4000 systems, there was a definite order to the way you put the cards in the QBOS. So I don't recall, but the higher priority devices were at the beginning and the lower ones at the far end. But all the ones doing most of the I/O or the bulk of the I/O, you would put at the end because otherwise it would stop the ones doing the small I/Os like terminal devices.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
having worked with the pre-release stuff, I got to work on pretty much every model of VAX that was existing that ever was produced, and one that never got shipped. And one that never got shipped was, if I recall correctly, they called it, I believe it was the 8240, which was a 4 CPU version of the 8200. I think the 82, which was weird.
Was it the 8270 that never shipped? I mean, the 8370 never shipped.
That one never shipped either, but that had 4 CPUs in it?
Yeah.
Maybe I got the numbers wrong.
Yeah.
But it never shipped because it actually performed worse than a single CPU of the same machine. And it turns out it was because the CPUs were sitting directly on the BI bus, and the BI bus got flooded with interprocessor coordination, and they couldn't get any field work done. That was fun. The other one that was the most fun, I think, was we prototyped Digital's first SSD, or solid state device. And it showed up in my lab as a PC board about this big, not this thick, but this size. And an interface card and a front panel. And it actually was the front panel for an RA81, I think.
Was it the ESE20?
I think that's what it ended up being. Yeah, it didn't have a number when we got it. It was just literally a prototype board. And we go to get it all set up, and the guy hits the on button. We're sitting there. We're sitting there, and we're sitting there, and all of a sudden it pops up as ready. I'm looking at the guy. What the heck's taking so long? He said, well, the drive had to spin up. I said, what? The RA interface card that is being used temporarily to actually try to do the testing, if it came up too fast, would say that the drive was faulty. So they actually had to build in a delay for it to not say to the interface that it was ready too fast. So they called it the spin up time. That was obviously addressed before they actually released it. But, yeah, but that thing screamed compared to obviously a hardware device. But it was, I'll never forget that, waiting for the the SSD to spin up.
Was that like late 80s? Does that sound right?
That was early 90s.
That was early 90s.
Followed by the ESE50.
Yeah.
I remember getting a solid. I worked at an ACT and the ACT program in Rochester. I'd order all the hardware at 20% of the meter price. But anyhow, it was like $15,000 an SSD.
The cost of things back then to today is just it's incredible what the costs were. But we used to get beat up on that stuff all the time. But it was fun to get to do testing like that, and I did spend a lot of time doing customer benchmarks, so I got to see a lot of different applications. I did RTE type benchmarks with remote terminal emulation. We actually had one VAX that would pretend to be a bunch of actual users. With initially it was RS-232 cables, so we had 500 cables stringing underneath the floor. That was always fun if one went bad. Then it went over laps, so it was easier. But that was a fun time too.
Did they have a benchmark center somewhere in New England? Where customers could
Marlboro had one. Nashville had one.
LA had one. City.
Yeah. So
aerospace.
any questions / stories? I got a million of them.